Hi, welcome everyone. I'm going to give us just a couple of seconds to get people logged on and set up. But I'm very excited for the event we have coming today. So do stay tuned. You're in the right place. Wonderful. So thank you guys so much for logging on today for our event on COVID-19 and the climate change crisis. My name is Sarah Humphreville. I'm an editor at Oxford University Press, and I'm so pleased to be joined by two OUP authors to break down this issue for us. First, we have Daniel Taillant. Daniel is founder and executive director of the Center for Human Rights and the Environment. Born in Argentina, raised in California, and now living in Florida, he has lived and worked around the world to promote sustainability and social justice, and is working on the global climate change architecture. He was key to getting the first glacier protection law passed in 2010, and his most recent book with OUP is entitled Meltdown, The Earth Without Glaciers. We're also joined by Alice Hill. Alice is a senior fellow for climate change policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, she served as special assistant to President Barack Obama and senior director for resilience policy on the National Security Council, and led the DHS leadership group responsible for biosecurity and biopreparedness efforts, including pandemic planning efforts. Her most recent book with Oxford is The Fight for Climate After COVID-19. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to join.
Nice to be with you.
Wonderful. So let's kind of dive right in here. In both of your books, recently released this past fall, you've both revealed a link to how we've responded to the COVID pandemic and how we must respond to climate change. How and why is the COVID pandemic and how we've dealt with it related to how we are dealing with or failing to deal with climate change? Alice, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you so much for having us today, Sarah, and thank you for editing my book. I'm very grateful for that. Climate change and COVID-19 are both catastrophic risks, and our experience with this pandemic has revealed the vulnerabilities that the threats pose. They honor no borders. They will freely cross despite all the efforts of humans to construct these jurisdictional boundaries that organize our efforts, our economies, our governments. But these two threats will not honor those. They also benefit from early action. In the case of climate change, both on the mitigation side, that means on the attempt to cut harmful greenhouse gas emissions that are forming that blanket of pollution around the globe, causing us to see rising temperatures with extreme drought, extreme heat, sea level rise following. And with COVID-19, we see that also early action, so cutting emissions will cut the amount of heating that we experience. Also adapting in advance of the changes that we can see with climate will help reduce damage. So too with action on COVID-19. In fact, as we see this new variant unfold, we actually are learning that governments have learned from their prior experience where they took more of a wait and see pose when we first heard about this emerging dynamic from Wuhan, China. You saw that there was a very scattered response. Much more quickly now, nations have attempted to close their borders, but we see the variant will cross borders. And they have also tried to take greater steps to protect their populations early on before the disease can take hold across the board. There are, of course, many other lessons to be derived, but the biggest is preparation and early action pay off in terms of overall reduction of risk.
Wonderful. Daniel, what did you think, in the process of writing Meltdown, what kind of came to mind as the pandemic unfolded?
Well, I look, as Alice does as well, at the challenges of implementing and resolving the problem. And it's very clear to me that the problem that we've seen with COVID and the problem that we see with climate change have a lot of similarities. first of all, this is a global problem that we're all part of. So if you think about how we've reacted to COVID in really acting as a global society, as a group of nations, as a group of individuals, as a group of countries, as a group of political leaders that have to respond to the emergencies that have been brought forth by COVID, we have a similar problem with climate. And the decisions that have to be made are very difficult in both cases, and they're monumental. And I go back sometimes to talk about how we talk about these things with our family. We sit around the table, and my kids, because I work on climate change, always ask me, how do we stop climate change? And when you start saying things like, well, we got to get rid of the internal combustion engine and we have to move to electric vehicles, these are decisions that are very big, that are very, very important, that bold leaders need to take. And we don't generally see those decisions. And yet, when COVID hit, we saw that sort of reaction from our leaders. We closed up airports. We stopped entire industries. We stopped trains. We stopped airplanes. We stopped shipping. All of these decisions are extremely difficult to take, and our leaders are reluctant to take them. And when we try to force these decisions, the internal reactions to the political system are usually, no, we can't do that. That's too hard. And it's a sort of the same response I get from my kids when I tell them the sorts of things we need to do to get away from climate change. They seem like impossible decisions to take, impossible actions to take at a global scale. And yet, for COVID, we made those decisions. We were so afraid. We were so startled by what was happening globally that we took those decisions because we had to take them. On the climate front, there'll be some differences, and maybe we can talk about those as our conversation goes on. But really, the climate challenges that we are facing are very similar. They may not be as immediate as what we have dealt with COVID, where your death, if you don't react, happens immediately. In the case of climate change, it's a more drawn out conclusion and end game, but yet the decisions are just as hard, just as difficult, and just as challenging for society.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So let's talk a bit specifically about COP26, since it was held so recently. COP26 was the first big climate meeting to be held in person after and during COVID. Why is that important to get everyone together like that? And I would be interested to hear from both of you on this to see how much COVID was part of that conversation, and what kind of general insights you can share with us about how that can be applied to the climate emergency. Daniel, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Well, I guess on the COVID front, the first thing I should say, having been at the COP, which is the climate summit, first big meeting that we've had internationally that I've gone to anyway in the last, 2 years almost, the reactions to COVID were very strong. We had to test every day before going in. You would not be allowed into the meeting areas without having a test done every morning. So we had to do our self-testing. So COVID was very present. It was very present not only in what we had to do, but it was also present in the back of our minds as we were discussing what to do about climate. And I think at this moment, at this juncture, as we're moving away from COVID, well, now with the new variant, maybe not so quickly, but as we thought we were moving away, the same challenges that we faced during COVID and the same need to react internationally, I think we all felt at the climate summit at COP26 in Glasgow. Our sense was that there was an emergency that we needed to deal with. For those of us that have been working on this for a long time, we've known this for a long time. But I really did get the sense that global leaders are really awakening in just the last few years to the urgency of the crisis. And I'd like to quote a very young climate activist, 17 years old. I met her at a dinner during Glasgow, and she's been working on promoting our awareness along with Greta and others in the youth movement. And I asked her what she thought about the summit. She was at the summit. She had been there for 2 weeks. If she could summarize it in a sentence or two, what she was feeling about the summit. And she said, no, I can do that in one word: urgency. And I got that sense from a lot of the negotiators, not always reflected in their decisions, but there is a growing sense of urgency and the importance that we do need to move quickly.
Yeah, no, I think that that's, I'm glad that you brought up the youth movement's interactions there, because I kind of want to come back to that as a kind of accelerator in some of these discussions. Alice, what about from your perspective?
Well, I think COP26 exceeded the billing that was occurring before the event. Of course, there were a number of statements that it wouldn't be a success, that this was not a good idea. But we saw some breakthroughs as a result of convening so many thousands of people in one place to focus on climate change. Probably some agreements that would have been harder to achieve because they're the product of the art of diplomacy. For one notable one, involved my country, the United States, and China, saying that they intended to work together on climate. That was not what their stated positions were before they walked into the summit. So we saw that outcome. We saw some pledges come forward because of this date certain that we would all be convening, and we saw the very important methane pledge, the one of the most harmful of our greenhouse gas pollutants because it heats the world so quickly. This, by reducing methane 30% by 2030, we can give ourselves a little more time to deal with carbon dioxide, for example, and its heating footprint. We also saw big statements from the financial sector over some $130 trillion worth of assets controlled by 400 plus firms, and all of those firms committed to net zero by 2050. Now, there's a lot of question marks behind that. What does net zero look like? Do we all have a common understanding? But at least that's a major step forward. And we saw, of course, the deforestation pledge from numerous countries that they would end deforestation by 2030. All of these are promises, only as good as the intent and the willingness to follow through. As Jorge said, it is just dependent on political will. But we got those. And then most importantly, we have 197 nations agreeing that we should try to keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times. That's a little clearer statement of the ambition coming out of the Paris Agreement. And I think it's remarkable that we have so many, virtually the entire globe, signaling that this is urgent and important. We will see next year. They set a deadline for themselves going in. There was some talk of making a deadline of every 5 years, 10 years. The deadline now for coming back with greater ambition is 1 year. So that will really be a much clearer test as to whether there'll be the necessary follow through to change the trajectory on climate change. So I think it was a modest success. It was President Alex Sharma, the UK president of COP26, who said that 1.5 degrees is still alive, but it has a very weak pulse. And that really is where we are right now. Of course, the urgency, as we've heard, is only accelerating. So we need to make sure that there is, in fact, the political will to get this done. And the youth will be, in my opinion, a significant factor in ensuring that there is stronger will going forward.
If I can jump in on Alice's comments, the structure of the COP, this is a convening of heads of state, of environment ministers, of global leaders, and it's a fairly rigid structure that has been around for a number of years now. And sometimes you don't get the fast action that you really need. And I think, Alice, you just mentioned, originally they were talking about maybe reconvening 5 years later to see how we're doing. But the science is telling us we don't have that long. We've got a decade and probably less to avoid surpassing tipping points. And tipping points are points after which you don't fix the problem anymore. Tipping points mean that we've gone too far and we cannot correct our climate problem. And so the time frame that we are hearing from the science, and this is very, very present in the last IPCC report. This is the group of leading climate scientists that come together to tell us where the science is. They're telling us in their last report that was published just a few months ago, just a few months before COP26, that we've got less than a decade left before we reach those tipping points. And if we don't act quickly, and this is not let's reconvene in 5 years to see how we're doing. This is let's reconvene, not even in a year, every 6 months even, to see how we're moving. That's how fast we need to react. And what I think was very present at COP was this sense of urgency needing to even step outside of the boundaries of the COP. And so when you mention the methane pledge, this is something that you and I have been working on. EDF is an organization that is part of that pledge, part of making that happen. You sit on their board. I am also in an organization that's working to craft that pledge. That came together in just a couple of months. It came together so quickly because countries like the US and China, that within the structures of the UN negotiations don't work together very well sometimes, realize that time is running out. So the methane pledge, the US-China agreement, they all happen on the margins of COP because there is this push and this need for our leaders to do more, to do it better, and to do it faster.
Yeah, I think both of you here have highlighted one thing that for those of us who, aren't knee deep in the climate by ourselves, have kind of picked up on is, this certainly isn't the first meeting like this. I mean, COP itself as a structure has been repeated, for years to come, and in years past. Where the United States often falls into perspective is having, been a major player in getting things signed and also perhaps not always following through on what gets signed at these meetings. Can either one of you, both of you, really talk about the differences that you witnessed in, the United States specific leadership on some of the things that got done or didn't get done here at this last meeting, and then more broadly, what other types of leadership are very important for us to get on board to be able to start making some of these more urgent changes? Obviously, national leadership is important, but what other areas of leadership would it be good for us to start, highlighting and pushing when it comes to this issue?
Well, I can jump in here. One of the things before the COP unfolded, there was a lot of talk here in the United States with regard to whether the infrastructure bills signing would have occurred before COP and whether this reconciliation, the Build Back Better bill would have occurred before COP. And I think among Americans and American diplomats, there was expressed concern we need to get that done. But when I got to COP, it was clear that the real question was longer term. It was the United States is making these pledges. Will it follow through? It wasn't so much about the perceived minutia, actually very important, but how this was going to get done was not an everyday concern, at least in the discussions I had. So I think that gave the U.S. more freedom to be able to present itself, as has been the intention of the Biden administration, as leaders in this space, announcing that the U.S. was back, that the pulling out from the Paris Agreement would no longer hold, and then you saw a large presence of U.S. diplomats there and about a dozen representatives from the president's cabinet, the president himself, big push. And then, of course, John Kerry was seemingly, the special envoy for climate, was seemingly everywhere at the COP, meeting with everyone and doing a lot of the backdoor negotiations or the backroom negotiations as well. And that gets to the question of leadership. Leadership is absolutely imperative. It's imperative for addressing the catastrophic risk of the pandemic. You can see very stark examples of that in the first rounds of the pandemic. If you compare the United States experience with that, for example, of South Korea. South Korea moved out very promptly. In fact, the disease was first detected on the very same day in January 2020 in the United States and in South Korea. South Korea took that moment, used their experience with SARS and MERS to make sure that they mobilized like an army, really, and had drive-through testing, contact tracing. The U.S., meanwhile, under President Trump at that time, he said, it's just one case, no big deal. We got it under control. And the experience of the nations began to diverge quickly, even though South Korea initially had the most cases outside of China of any nation. But as it cracked down and really made sure it was addressing the threat, last time I checked, it had this summer about South Korea had suffered about 2,000 deaths in a similar time, with a population of about 50 million. In a similar time, we had suffered over 600,000 deaths with a population of about 300 million. So very stark differences. And that's when you know that if you are dealing with something of this size, scope, and urgency, it matters whether the leaders act with the appropriate concern and alacrity.
Yeah. Leadership is so fundamental. And I think we can look at the United States over the past 6 or 7 years and see, that leadership change and the influence that it had on the world. It's very sad to say that the U.S. has to say that they're back. We should never have left, really is the underlying reality. But at this moment, I mentioned earlier, the importance of big, difficult decisions, to switch over an industry from an internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. That's a big decision, and your leaders have to be clear. They have to send those signals. They have to let society know where we're going, where we want to get to, and how fast we're going to get there. We're seeing out of California the impacts of climate change during these climate wildfires. They're having to reach into new terminology like atmospheric rivers and cyclone bombs and heat domes, because climate change is taking over. And so when the governor recently said no more fossil fuel engines by 2035, which is probably too late, that's a big decision. 20 of California's auto manufacturers have to go electric vehicles, and you don't do that overnight. You don't do that in a few years. It's a decade-long adjustment that you need to make, and that leader at this moment in time did what the leader had to do. We can say more is needed. We can say less is needed, but those steps are fundamental, and we need to see that from leadership around the world. This has to be an all of government, but also an all of society decision. We all have to step up. And so the next time you're going to change out your AC system, the next time you're going to buy a new car, we all have to participate. Of course, our leaders, our political leaders, are the ones that make these radical decisions that can shift society, that could change the way we do things. But we all have to participate in that leadership. We all have to do it on election day, but we also have to do it on our own election days when we elect our appliances, our vehicles, our lifestyles, and how we live. It's something that all of society needs to lead with.
No, absolutely. I come back to, Daniel, the cover of your book, Meltdown. It's a little bit behind me. It's probably too small for everyone to see. There you go. Thank you.
There we go.
As you're talking about the urgency in that question, that cover comes to mind for me so much, because it is just, full of motion and vigor and catastrophe. Seeing something like that, something so seemingly indestructible, falling apart essentially in front of us. With COVID, as both of you have mentioned, this was a borderless crisis. Perhaps we thought, unlike other pandemics, that it was going to be isolated to a specific region or a specific country. This was a crisis that, if not everyone in the globe, the vast majority of the population had to interact with in a major way. Climate change emergencies aren't going to react in that same way. There isn't going to be that one big moment that rallies everyone together. So how would each one of you, I would say, keep the momentum going after a conference like COP26 as individuals in the work that you do and as part of the organizations that you work with? Daniel, do you want to start?
Yeah. Thank you for that intro on my book cover, but I want to read page, I guess it's 3, and it's a very short dedication that I did in the book. It's to my son, Ulysses, who's 17. I have a hard time sometimes relating to a 17-year-old, but the dedication says, to my son, Ulysses, who constantly surprises me with youth's fresh and fearless, intrepid, and baggage-free questioning of the status quo, and with his envious and unapologetic approach to life and everything. And the one thing that I will distinguish between my generation and my son's generation is that, during COVID, in 2 weeks, we cleaned the air. People in Nepal and India, when black carbon emissions stopped, some of these people saw the Himalayas for the first time in their life. And what youth has learned from this, and I try to talk a little bit about that in one of the chapters of my book, is that we can change. We can do things that my generation thought unthinkable. And when I talk to my kids now about climate change, they just say, well, just do it. Stop thinking about all the reasons why you can't do it and why it's so difficult and why you can't go EV and why fossil fuels are necessary and why we can't have fully electric vehicles, and just do it. And this needs to be the way we think. We need to look beyond our fear and our barriers and our no mentality about why we can't just possibly do all the things we need to do to stop climate change. I think that is a key message here, and how we move forward is really removing those barriers, removing the fear of failure, and moving forward. And I'll make one last statement. Back when the United States made it to the moon, there was a speech by John F. Kennedy before Congress where he talked about all the ways that technology was going to get humans to the moon. And he was trying to convince Congress, and I'm trying to make parallels now to our infrastructure bills and our Build Back Better plans. He was trying to convince Congress to put the money up to the race to the moon. And he described breaking through the atmosphere with a technology that was not even invented yet, that would be necessary for the ship not to burn back up when it came through the atmosphere again. So that attitude of, we don't care what the limitations are, we don't care what the barriers are, we need to do this because this has to be done. I mean, that is the sort of unapologetic approach that we need to resolve climate change.
Alice, do you have something to, when it comes to that one big moment question?
Well, I think that's one of the challenges that we suffer from when it comes to galvanizing the type of political will that we're talking about. There isn't a single no more moment. That was the term that my co-author and I used in our first book for when there's a big storm, there's massive flooding, a community, say the Netherlands in the 1950s, said no more. We're going to become the best, most flood-prepared nation in the world. And then they had more flooding in 1993, and that even got them more galvanized to ensure. And so they're the best water engineers. They plan for the 1 in 10,000 year flood. We're planning in the United States for the 1 in 100 year flood, and we don't have accurate flood maps. So we are not at the same space. But for the Dutch, they face an existential risk from sea level rise, and the entire nation essentially suffers the same risk. That's not true for example, if you take the United States. We will see climate change occur in extreme heat in various places across the United States. Wildfires, mostly right now in the West. It will move to the Southeast. We're going to see these huge rain bombs drop much more frequently in places on the eastern seaboard, but in other areas. But it's not one single event like a pandemic. We all suffered this threat of the disease at once, which was able to have nations across the globe suddenly start spewing out funds to their populations, help to their populations. We just don't get that with climate change. And I'm not advocating that we should, but it makes it, or that would be the solution, but it makes it very difficult to really see the kinds of activity that we need. And then you add on this the tragedy of the horizon. It's the worst of these events will occur further on in the future as we add even more pollution to our atmosphere. And it's difficult to get people to be concerned about future generations. The social scientists tell us there are many reasons for that. We assess risk based on what's happened to ourselves, our families, our neighbors. Most of us haven't really experienced the kind of extreme events that climate change will bring. We've had a taste of them, but not the kind that the scientists warn us are ahead. And we also, we judge things on recency bias. And we also, happily, are all optimists. So in the back of our minds, we're thinking, this really isn't going to happen to me. And if we do, in our polling, it shows people, the highest numbers are, climate change will hurt people in other nations. Then lower numbers for will it hurt those in your own nation, lower numbers for will it hurt you in your community, and the lowest of all, will it hurt you? So we're optimists. We think this is going to be somebody else's problem, not ours. And in my dozen years of working on this, I think it's the cognitive biases, just the way humans assess risk, that has been the biggest drag on our ability to get the proper action that we need. It doesn't assist matters that we have deep polarization in the nation regarding whether this is a serious threat or not. And we actually have seen in recent days, the numbers of Republicans who do not believe it's a serious risk have increased. So our polarization has deepened about this threat, even though there's growing worldwide consensus and consensus among the scientists that now is the time to take action.
I'd like to piggyback on that last comment, Alice. So I was in Glasgow just recently, and I was at the methane pavilion where we were building this methane pledge that was eventually signed by over 100 countries to put us on the methane pathway. And just down the road, there was a meeting of the business sector. And they were talking about their climate policies and what the business community is doing. And all of a sudden, I heard someone say insurance and risk. And I turn around, and it was Ricardo Lara. And for those of you who don't know Ricardo Lara, he was the insurance commissioner of California. But he also happens to be the father of the only existing piece of legislation on short-lived climate pollutants, which California has. And Ricardo Lara is someone who really understands this short-term problem that we face on climate change. And what he is working on, and he's talking to other insurance commissioners around the country and around the world to do, is to think about this issue of risk and how we evaluate risk and the importance that we factor in climate change equations into our risk assessment. My daughter lives in Miami today, and I'm still amazed whenever I go down there, being, climate change central. Miami is probably the most at risk for sea level rise of the entire nation, and buildings are still going up. They're still building all the time, everywhere. No one is really anticipating what's about to happen. Just a few months before I published Meltdown, a community in one of the Keys had flooded. And usually floods, they come 2-3 feet of water, and then 2-3 days later, the flooded water is gone. Well, this flood water lasted 90 days. It wasn't going away. And meanwhile, politicians around South Florida are all discussing how they're going to build walls and put in pumps to pump water out to who knows where, because it's all going to be flooding. Our risk assessment framework is not up to par yet. And I think this is one of the most important things that we need to think about as we move forward. Where is climate change going to be changing fundamentally the way that we live and the way our economies are built?
So if I can just jump in here, absolutely. One of the hardest lessons about climate change is that it affects everything. It affects every natural system, our waterways, our ecosystems, our food system. It also affects every built environment, in that everything has been based, all the choices about where and how to build have been based on the assumption that the past is a good guide for the present. Remember, that's how we all judge risk. Have we experienced it? So that has actually been a pretty good guide for the last 8 to 10,000 years that humans have been flourishing. It's not so good a guide now. And one of the issues that is going to be a real challenge is, as mentioned, insurance. I happen to chair a working group for Commissioner Lara on climate change and insurance. And the underlying fear here is that property and casualty insurance, so your homeowner's policy for things like wildfire, and we do have a national flood insurance program, but that these insurance products will become so expensive that either nobody will want to buy them or insurance companies won't want to offer them because the risks are too high. And if we do not get our emissions under control, CEOs of major reinsurance companies, those are the insurance companies that insure insurance companies. So you get your property insurance from State Farm or some other insurance, and then they buy insurance from a reinsurer. So the reinsurers are looking at global risks. And those reinsurers, some of those CEOs have said, if we get to a 3 or 4 degrees Celsius world, we can't insure. There's no insurance available. And that has really significant underlying economic impacts, because if you can't insure a community, that means if the bad thing happens, a huge economic devastation. Insurance is a viable product because it gets people back up on their feet much more quickly. It gets them back to where they were. It means their kids don't get pulled out of school. It means they don't have to move, or if they have to move, they have paid for temporary shelter. So this is going to be, it's an underappreciated risk right now, that's what we're talking about. But in the coming months and years, and we're seeing it play out in California, and we're actually seeing it play out in Florida. Insurance or companies are saying, hey, this is too big for us. We'd rather not write these policies. And then who's left as the insurer? It's unclear. It could be that the government steps in, but that poses its own perils as well in terms of, as we've seen from the National Flood Insurance Program here in the United States, it has had difficulty remaining solvent in the face of increasing claims. So that's why it's so important that COP26 delivers results so that we don't get to these kinds of extreme events going forward that just basically throw off our fundamental systems like insurance.
No, I mean, and for those of you out there who are really intrigued by the kind of these economic questions about it, Alice's previous book with Leonardo Martinez Diaz, Building a Resilient Tomorrow, introduces these concepts in a very grounding way. I strongly recommend it. One of the bright spots of editing that book was understanding the entire concept of coinsurance and learning about, Alice, I'm sure you could recall the, the details stronger than I, but on, countries coming together to be able to create insurance policies especially for individuals who are not going to have access for that kind of sharing the risk in that broader sense. It's one of those bright spots that it's, in conversations like this where it just, the mounting concern, starts to make people feel like this is a problem too big to solve. You have a concrete example like that helps you understand there are ways that we can be chipping away at this issue. Daniel, I'm going to turn it to you here. Can we chat a little bit about, because you referenced this earlier, and it's a topic I want to make sure we have a chance to dive into. Can we chat a little bit about short-lived climate pollutants? Why are they important, and why aren't they more prominent in some of these global climate negotiation conversations?
Well, Alice touched on it a little earlier, which is that short-lived pollutants are pollutants that have a short-term impact. So we've all been talking, and we all know about the importance of reducing CO2. That's what the world is obsessed with. And COP26, and the 26 is a year in time, right? So COP25 is a year before that, and COP24, so you can see how many years we've been discussing this. The focus really has been on CO2. But we can get rid of all CO2 today, immediately. Let's just say everything went EV, and we went, zero emissions tomorrow. And the world got rid of CO2, all of it, everywhere. we wouldn't see improvements for hundreds of years. And that's because CO2 remains in the atmosphere for a long time. It's a long-lived pollutant. Short-lived pollutants are pollutants that go into the atmosphere, contaminate a lot, have a huge climate impact, but don't stay there for very long. They stay there for a few years, a few decades, sometimes even just a few months, weeks, or even days. And the main ones are methane, which is natural gas. And here is something that the oil and gas industry has been trying to tell us, that natural gas somehow is a nice thing. It's a bridge fuel. It's clean. Not true. Natural gas is 85 times worse than CO2 for our climate. The other pollutant is black carbon, or more commonly known as soot. You see this, when you're going down the highway and you see the black smoke coming out of an engine. That's soot. And this black carbon is terrible for our climate. It's terrible for glaciers when it gets into the airstreams. Just like wearing a dark shirt on a hot day, if you put black soot on a glacier, it gets very warm and it melts very rapidly. And it's also very bad for human health. Another of the pollutants are HFCs, which is the impronounceable word hydrofluorocarbons. I call them dirty refrigerants. And basically, there are good refrigerants and bad refrigerants. And some of them are thousands of times worse than CO2. And finally, O3 or ozone, which is basically smog. And it's made from a mix of gases that you will get in places like agricultural lands where you have the diesel engines going and other emissions, and they combine to form smog. These four main pollutants have very short atmospheric lives. And if we get rid of them quickly, we slow climate change, and we slow it very quickly. And this is why in the last report by the IPCC, AR6 it's called, it draws attention to the short-lived pollutants and methane in particular. And this is why we've been promoting this methane pledge, because if we get rid of these pollutants in the short term, we slow climate change very quickly. And it's the only way that we keep to 1.5 degrees of warming, which is what the scientists tell us is the tipping point.
No, thank you. I think that's because again, so much of the conversation can be focused on CO2, on, these kind of bigger things I think people have been able to wrap their heads around. But it's a little bit like fighting a multi-headed dragon. You start to put all of your focus on one, and then something like what you said with natural gas takes over, and people believe that they're making the right decision. And, they could actually be making one that doubles down on the harms a bit. So I'm going to ask this one question. I have a feeling I know the answer from both of you, but I think it's, good to ask it anyway. Alice, to start with you, are we doing too little and too late to stop and reverse climate change?
Yes, but if we do more now, we'll have better results. I think there are two important points for me in this discussion. The first is the IPCC report that we've been talking about here, and it's a report. It's over 1,000 pages long, but the executive summary, which is under 100 pages long, every country agreed to this report. We got over 200 scientists from 60 nations working together, and they agree on every word in that executive summary. And one of the important findings in that executive summary is that every incremental amount of heating brings worsening events. So our goal should be to stop as much heating as we possibly can. Unfortunately, with carbon, even if we got our pollutants to zero, because of the delayed heating effect, as we've said, it's been up there for a long time and it's causing heating to continue, we would still see some heating, which brings these extreme events that are so damaging to natural systems and human-built systems. So we need to do everything we can to control heating and end heating. And then we need to also make sure that we prepare for a world where we will even have to suffer these impacts, even though we have great success on cutting the harmful pollutants. And that combination should, I hope, motivate all of us to reconsider how we choose to live, our personal choices, and then also encourage our governments and our leaders to make sure that we're making the right choices now to have a better future.
Yeah, Daniel, same question.
Yeah, so I'm a conflicted person on this question because on the one hand, I'm an optimist, I'm an activist, I work on climate policy, and I want us to do the right thing. And I think we can do a lot. I think we should do as much as we can to slow warming. But since I started studying glaciers and understanding their relevance and importance to our global climate, I learned something that's very scary, which is it takes about 80,000 years to make an ice age and about 20,000 years to melt one. And we are very fortunate to be living in an interglacial era where climate is rather benign and rather nice. It doesn't last forever, and there are natural cycles that will take us back into an ice age and into severe climate change all over again. The question is, how long do we want to live in this nice climate that we have? What we are doing is destroying this benign climate, and we're accelerating this change. And we're actually, by the estimates of some scientists, maybe even detouring our pathway to not being able to go back to an ice age and not being able to reestablish our natural climate cycle. And in that regard, I'm less optimistic about being able to fix the problem in a way that is sustainable. But I do agree with Alice that we can slow things down, we can make life more livable, and we could avoid some of the worst impacts. I'd like to sort of end my thought on this point by quoting Greta, who just so often says all the right things, but she said very recently, we need to stop focusing on dates and numbers and actually accept and acknowledge the fact that we need to reduce our emissions right now. We can talk about 2030, we can talk about 2040, as much as we want, but it's what we're doing right now that really matters. And we need to do more, we need to do it better, and we need to do it faster.
No, that's an excellent quote. And it ties right into what I think will be our last question here as we kind of wrap up our time. So both of you are incredibly active in this space at the international level, at the national level, at the local level. Clearly change needs to happen. It needs to happen immediately. I love that point about throwing out the dates. There's no magic switch that's going to turn off at 2030 or 2040. But Daniel, starting with you, what policies make the most sense for someone to really advocate for on the local level? And I'd like us to also talk about the national and international level as well. But what is the best next step for someone to really put their energy behind in understanding the kind of both mitigation and adaptation changes that need to happen for us to be able to move forward?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to a bit of what I said earlier about an all of society approach. In our own sphere of influence, we need to make those difficult decisions. So when we do change our car, when we do buy a new home, when we change our appliances, and when we go vote, it's very important that we are voting in the right way, voting not only for our leaders, but voting for our lifestyles. So we need to do what we can to make these changes quickly. In my own work, I'm focused on the short-lived pollutants because I feel this sense of urgency, and the people around me that I work with also have this urgency, and the scientists are saying that if we don't do these pollutants first, we don't get anywhere. And so that's why we're working on the methane and the black carbon and the HFCs and the ozone. So right now it's about methane. We just came out of Glasgow where this methane pledge to reduce 30% by 2030 was signed. And that has to do with 3 areas of engagement: oil and gas. And we know what we need to do in oil and gas. There's a lot of methane emissions that shouldn't be emitted, and there are ways to reduce those. And so we're going to be pushing the industry to do that. It's all about landfills as well. That's another third of the problem. And we should be generating less waste, and it should not be, organic waste should not be going to the landfills. And when it does, it should be captured and it should be used either to, to get rid of in an effective way, or to be used for energy. And finally, in agricultural waste, we need to stop thinking that this is all about getting rid of hamburgers. It's not. It's about reducing waste, and it's about making efficient use of that waste so that we're not emitting these emissions directly into the atmosphere. These are the 3 areas I'm working on right now, but there's so many other things that we could all do, and it goes down to lifestyle choices that you have, day to day.
Yeah, Alice, same question.
Well, I agree with everything Daniel said. I also believe that we all need to talk about this more. Our polling shows that it's not a frequent topic of conversation among people in the United States. And I think that we need to move it up on the agenda so that we're talking about what we can do individually and what we will need to do collectively and on the global stage. So that's an immediate thing that anyone can do. And the second thing is climate change is an area that's evolving so quickly. You know, when I started, there was very few mentions in mainstream media about climate change. Now it's completely different. We have journalists covering in multitude of publications, bringing forth stories about both the adaptation, the mitigation, and then this third area that's developing, geoengineering, where we're going to have some kind of engineered solution to climate change. All of us should be, in my opinion, taking the time to understand more. And the reason is because climate change is already affecting everything, and its impacts will only grow. So this is particularly important for young people. Unfortunately, I meet a number of young people who have gotten their degrees from very fine institutions, and they've taken no classes on climate change. They don't know about climate change. I meet, for example, students who have foreign relations who haven't studied climate change. That will be a hindrance because, as we've seen in Glasgow, we have 197 nations gathering. That it doesn't happen for most topics in the international sphere. It is central to how nations will relate to each other going forward. So anyone interested in international diplomacy should get a grounding in climate change. But you could do the same for architecture. It's not routinely taught in our schools of architecture, nor is climate change routinely taught in our schools of medicine or public health. I was so excited to see that first-year students at the Emory University Medical School arrived and said, hey, wait a minute, you're not teaching us anything here about climate change in our core curricula. You need to change that. And to their credit, the administrators did immediately. But that's the aberration. It's not the rule. And we need to see an educated population that can deal with the challenges that we have already. And as we've heard, they will continue to unfold over time. And if we don't have engineers who understand the risks, urban planners who understand the risks, really artists who can't communicate this in ways that we can all understand it visually or through storytelling, whatever, it just slows our ability to take action. So I think that talking about it is very important, but I think education, including self-education and then formal education, are also critical components to having better outcomes going forward.
Well, you've teed me up so well there with that final point to bring it back to both of y'all's books here, Meltdown and The Fight for Climate After COVID-19. The more, I think that last point's exactly right, though. The more that we are openly talking about these issues and bringing people together with different areas of expertise to really break them down, hopefully the more talking about it doesn't become some sort of taboo or something that we can just ignore. So I want to thank you both so much for spending the hour with us to break this down, Daniel and Alice. It's been such a pleasure to get to speak with you, and hopefully we'll be able to have the opportunity to do something like this in the future. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Have a great